When divorce didn't kill love, the journey back to each other. The divorce papers were already signed when Emily realized the silence hurt more than the shouting ever did. The house in suburban Ohio felt too big now, every room echoing with memories she couldn't outrun. She stood in the kitchen one night, staring at the faint coffee stain on the counter where Mark used to lean every morning, half awake, joking about how she made it too strong. She had wanted peace when she asked for the divorce. What she got instead was emptiness. Mark felt it too, though he'd never admit it out loud. He lived in a small apartment across town, walls bare, television always on for noise. At night, he lay awake replaying every argument, every moment he chose pride over patience, work over listening, silence over love. Neither of them had cheated, no dramatic betrayal, just years of emotional neglect, unresolved resentment, and the quiet erosion that happens when two people stop fighting for each other and start fighting against each other. By the time they realized what was happening, the distance between them felt unbridgeable, and divorce seemed like the only way to breathe again. They told friends it was mutual. They told family it was for the best. They told themselves they'd be happier apart. But happiness didn't come. What came were awkward holidays, empty weekends, and the strange pain of knowing the person who knew you best was now a stranger by law. Emily tried dating. The men were kind enough, some even charming, but none of them felt like home. Mark threw himself into work, promotions stacking up like trophies that brought no satisfaction. Late at night, when the city outside his window went quiet, he found himself scrolling through old photos he pretended he'd forgotten to delete. Their wedding day, their first apartment, a blurry picture of Emily laughing in the rain. He hated himself for missing her, because missing her meant admitting the divorce hadn't fixed what was broken. The first crack in the wall between them came on a random Tuesday afternoon when Emily's car wouldn't start in a grocery store parking lot. Her phone battery was dying, and without thinking, she dialed Mark's number. The line rang twice before he answered, surprised, cautious, and instantly flooded with emotions he hadn't prepared for. She tried to sound casual, but her voice shook as she explained. 20 minutes later, Mark pulled into the lot, the same old truck she could recognize anywhere. The moment they saw each other, something shifted. No anger, no accusations, just two people standing awkwardly beside a broken car, realizing that despite everything, the instinct to show up for each other was still alive. They talked while waiting for roadside assistance, small talk at first, then laughter, the familiar kind that came easily, as if no time had passed at all. When the tow truck arrived, Emily felt a lump in her throat because she didn't want the moment to end. After that, small interactions became more frequent. Texts about mail that still went to the old house turned into conversations about work, about mutual friends, about memories neither of them admitted they cherished. They kept boundaries, careful not to cross lines, but the emotional tension was undeniable. Mark noticed how Emily still tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Emily noticed how Mark still listened the same way, fully when he wasn't distracted by stress. They started meeting for coffee, telling themselves it was just familiarity, just closure. But closure didn't feel like this. Closure didn't make Emily's heart race when Mark smiled, or make Mark drive home wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life by letting her go. The real test came when old wounds resurfaced. One evening, over dinner, an argument sparked over the same issue that had driven them apart years earlier, Mark's work obsession and Emily's feeling of being invisible. The air thickened, voices rose, and for a moment it felt like they were right back where they started. Emily stood up, ready to leave, her voice trembling as she said, "This is why we didn't work." Mark watched her walk toward the door and felt something snap inside him. Instead of shutting down like he always had, he spoke, really spoke. He admitted his fear of failure, how providing had become his identity, how he didn't know how to be present without feeling like he was falling behind. Emily stopped, turned around. For the first time, she heard vulnerability instead of defensiveness, and for the first time Mark saw Emily not as demanding, but as someone who had been quietly starving for emotional connection. Healing wasn't quick. It wasn't romantic montages or instant forgiveness. There were setbacks, moments when trust wavered, when fear whispered that trying again would only lead to more pain. They went to counseling separately at first, then together, learning how to communicate without attacking, how to listen without preparing a defense. They confronted their own flaws instead of blaming each other. Emily learned she had used silence as punishment. Mark learned he had used busyness as avoidance. Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt something new, not the marriage they lost, but a stronger, more honest version of it. One night, months later, Mark stood outside Emily's house, rain pouring down like it had on their wedding day. He hadn't planned what to say. He just knew he couldn't keep living with regret. When she opened the door, he told her the truth, that divorce hadn't killed his love, that time apart had only revealed how deeply rooted it was, that he didn't want to repeat the past, but was willing to fight for a future, even if it scared him. Emily cried, not because she was unsure, but because she'd been waiting to hear those words longer than she'd admitted. She told him love hadn't disappeared for her either, that it had just been buried under hurt, and that maybe this time they could choose each other with open eyes instead of expectations. They didn't rush back into marriage. They dated again, intentionally, awkwardly, beautifully. They learned how to fall in love not as young dreamers, but as two people who had been broken and chose healing. When they finally remarried, it wasn't a grand ceremony, just close family, honest vows, and a quiet understanding that love wasn't the absence of failure, but the willingness to return, to repair, to forgive. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was real. Divorce hadn't killed their love. It had exposed it, tested it, and in the end, refined it into something stronger than either of them had known before.
Years later, Emily would say that the hardest part of loving Mark again wasn't trusting him, it was trusting herself. After the second wedding, life didn't suddenly soften its edges. Bills still arrived, stress still followed Mark home from work. Emily still had days when old fears crept in quietly, reminding her how easily love could slip through their fingers if they weren't careful. But this time, they paid attention. They spoke about things before they became wounds. They learned that love wasn't proven in grand gestures, but in the decision to stay present when it was uncomfortable. On quiet evenings, they sat on the porch, the same porch where years earlier they had avoided each other with phones in their hands, and now they talked about everything: dreams they'd postponed, mistakes they'd forgiven, and the strange way losing each other had taught them how to truly see one another. Still, the past didn't disappear just because they had chosen a future. There were moments when Emily caught herself flinching at Mark's late nights, her chest tightening as memories resurfaced. There were nights when Mark stared at the ceiling, terrified that one misstep would send everything crumbling again. One evening, after Mark missed a dinner because of an unexpected work emergency, Emily sat alone at the table, candles burning down to wax puddles, the old ache rising in her throat. When Mark finally walked through the door, apologizing breathlessly, he saw it in her eyes, the fear, not the anger. Instead of explaining or defending himself, he sat down beside her and held her hand, grounding her in the present, reminding her that being late didn't mean being gone. She cried then, not because of the dinner, but because for the first time she felt safe enough to admit she was scared. Their story began to affect the people around them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Friends who had watched the divorce with quiet sadness now watched the restoration with disbelief. Some admired it, others questioned it. "Aren't you afraid it'll happen again?" people asked. Emily and Mark learned that reconciliation invites opinions, but love requires courage. They didn't pretend they were a fairy tale, they told the truth when asked, that forgiveness was daily, that choosing each other was sometimes exhausting, that restoration was harder than walking away, but infinitely more meaningful. Slowly, they realized their journey wasn't just about them anymore. It was a testament to the idea that broken doesn't always mean finished. One autumn afternoon, Emily found an old box in the attic labeled "marriage stuff." Inside were cards they'd written before the divorce, full of promises they hadn't known how to keep back then. She read them quietly, tears slipping down her face, not from regret but from understanding. They hadn't failed because they didn't love each other, they had failed because they didn't know how to protect that love. When Mark came upstairs and saw her sitting there surrounded by memories, she handed him one of the letters. He read it slowly, then laughed softly through his tears. "We meant every word," he said. "We just didn't know how to live it yet." That night, they wrote new letters, not naive vows, but honest ones, acknowledging fear, imperfection, and the commitment to choose growth over comfort. Time passed, not dramatically, but faithfully, the kind of time that heals through consistency rather than miracles. Mark learned to leave work at work. Emily learned to speak her needs without apology. They argued sometimes, but arguments no longer felt like threats. They felt like conversations that mattered. On their anniversary, they didn't celebrate the number of years married. They celebrated the distance they'd traveled, the lessons learned through loss, and the strength it took to return to each other when pride would have been easier. One night, during a storm that rattled the windows, Emily lay awake listening to the rain, Mark's arm draped protectively over her. She realized something then that settled deep in her soul. Love wasn't proven by never breaking apart, but by the willingness to rebuild without pretending the cracks never existed. Divorce hadn't been the end of their story. It had been the turning point that forced them to confront who they were and who they wanted to become, both individually and together. And so their journey continued, not as a flawless romance, but as a living, breathing choice made every day. They knew the world loved simple endings, neat conclusions tied with bows, but their love wasn't simple. It was resilient. It had been tested by silence, distance, and legal finality, and it had survived. When people asked how they found their way back, Emily would smile softly and say, "We didn't find our way back, we built a new road forward." And Mark, squeezing her hand, would add, "Divorce didn't kill love, it taught us how to fight for it." The real storm arrived years later, quietly, the way life-changing moments often do, without warning or ceremony. It began with a phone call Mark took on a Thursday afternoon, his voice unusually flat when he told Emily he'd be home early. She knew something was wrong before he said anything else. When he walked through the door, his shoulders were slumped in a way she hadn't seen since the divorce years ago, and in that instant, fear gripped her chest. He told her the company he'd given decades to was downsizing, restructuring, moving in a different direction, all the phrases that sounded harmless until they landed squarely on his identity. He had lost his job. The silence that followed was heavy, not with anger but with uncertainty. Emily reached for him, but Mark pulled away, not out of rejection, but out of shame. The old instinct stirred, withdrawal, self-blame, the belief that his worth was tied to his ability to provide. Emily saw it happening in real time and felt a familiar panic rise. This was how it started before. This was how distance grew. In the weeks that followed, the house filled with tension that neither of them spoke aloud. Mark sent out resumes endlessly, each rejection email chipping away at his confidence. Emily tried to be supportive, but fear made her voice sharper than she intended. Money became a constant, unspoken presence at the dinner table. Some nights, Mark stayed up late scrolling job boards, the glow of his phone lighting up the same walls that once witnessed their separation. Emily lay awake beside him, wondering if love could survive another season of loss. She hated herself for thinking it, but trauma remembers even when the heart wants to forget. The breaking point came one evening when Emily suggested, gently at first, that Mark consider a position beneath his previous title, something temporary. The words struck him like an accusation. His voice rose, defensive, wounded, and suddenly they were standing in the kitchen again, years collapsing into seconds, the same argument wearing a new mask. Emily shouted that she was scared. Mark shouted that she didn't believe in him. The air cracked under the weight of everything unsaid. When Mark stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Emily sank to the floor, shaking, terrified that history was repeating itself despite all their effort, despite all their growth. Mark drove aimlessly that night, rage giving way to despair. He pulled into an empty parking lot and sat in the dark, head in his hands, realizing how close he was to losing everything again, not because he didn't love Emily, but because he didn't know how to let her see him broken. For the first time, he admitted to himself that restoration wasn't a one-time victory, it was a lifelong discipline. He thought about the years they'd wasted avoiding vulnerability, about how nearly losing her once had almost destroyed him. Sitting there, alone, he made a choice, not to be strong, but to be honest. When he returned home, the lights were still on. Emily sat on the couch, eyes red, exhaustion etched into her face. Mark didn't defend himself, he didn't explain, he apologized, not just for the argument, but for the fear he had caused, for the walls he'd started to rebuild without realizing it. He told her he was scared too, that losing his job had made him feel small, useless, and terrified of becoming someone she'd regret choosing again. Emily listened, heart pounding, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised them both. She told him she wasn't afraid of financial struggle, she was afraid of emotional abandonment. She reminded him that this time they had promised not to disappear when life got hard. That night didn't fix everything, but it changed the direction of the story. Mark accepted a temporary position months later, humbling, necessary, grounding. Emily picked up extra freelance work. Their lifestyle shifted, but something else strengthened. They learned to measure success differently. Conversations became deeper. Gratitude became intentional. The struggle forced them to rely on each other in ways comfort never had. Slowly, Mark rebuilt his career, but more importantly, he rebuilt his sense of self apart from achievement. Then came the diagnosis. Emily found the lump during a routine moment that should have meant nothing. The doctor's office smelled sterile and unfamiliar when the word cancer entered their lives like an intruder. Time fractured after that. Appointments blurred together. Treatment plans replaced weekend plans. Mark became Emily's anchor, attending every visit, memorizing medical terms he'd never wanted to know, holding her hair back during the worst nights. Fear stalked him constantly, not just of losing her, but of surviving without her. Emily, watching him care for her with unwavering devotion, understood something profound. This man had not only come back to her, he had grown into someone who knew how to stay. Cancer stripped away illusions quickly. There was no room for old grudges, no energy for petty resentment. They spoke openly about death, about gratitude, about love. Emily told Mark that even if her time was limited, she had no regrets about choosing him again. Mark told her that loving her twice had been the greatest privilege of his life. They cried together, not in despair, but in reverence for what they had built after everything tried to destroy it. Emily survived, not easily, not without scars, but she survived, and so did their marriage. Standing together one morning after her final treatment, sunlight streaming through the window, Mark held her hand and felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. They had faced loss, separation, fear, pride, poverty, illness, and love had remained, changed, tested, weathered, but alive. Years later, when strangers asked about their relationship, they never romanticized the pain. They spoke honestly about divorce, about how close they came to letting fear win, about the courage it took to return, and the discipline it took to stay. Emily would say love wasn't something you fall into once, it's something you choose again after you've seen how badly it can hurt. Mark would say restoration isn't about going back, it's about becoming better than you were before the breaking. Their story didn't end with perfection, it ended with perseverance, with two people who learned that love isn't fragile, it's forged. And in the quiet moments when the house was still and the past felt far away, Emily would rest her head on Mark's shoulder and think about how close they'd come to missing this life, this depth, this second chance. Divorce hadn't killed their love. It had challenged it, refined it, and ultimately revealed its true strength.
As the years moved forward, the intensity of survival slowly gave way to something quieter, but just as profound. Life after cancer didn't return to normal, it settled into something more deliberate. Emily woke each morning with a heightened awareness of time, of how fragile and precious ordinary days truly were. Mark noticed it in the way she lingered over breakfast, in how she reached for his hand without reason, in how laughter came more easily now that fear had been named and faced. They spoke less about someday and more about now. Vacations didn't need to be extravagant. Evenings on the couch mattered. The simple fact of being together felt earned, not assumed. Yet even peace carries its own challenges. When Emily returned to work, she struggled with a sense of displacement, unsure of who she was beyond survival. Mark, having spent years in protector mode, didn't immediately know how to step back without feeling guilty. Small misunderstandings crept in, not explosive, but subtle, the kind that quietly tests whether growth is real or rehearsed. One afternoon, Emily snapped at Mark over something insignificant and immediately saw the hurt flicker across his face. The room fell silent. Old fear threatened to rush in, but instead of retreating, Emily exhaled and apologized. Mark accepted it without hesitation. In that moment, they both realized how far they'd come, not because they never hurt each other, but because they repaired quickly and without pride. Their restored marriage began attracting people in quiet ways. Friends confided in them about struggling relationships. Coworkers asked how they'd made it through divorce and illness without becoming bitter. Emily often hesitated before answering because the truth wasn't neat. It wasn't a formula. It was effort, humility, and a willingness to stay emotionally exposed even when it felt unsafe. She would say, "We stopped trying to win arguments and started trying to understand." Mark would add, "And we learned that love doesn't survive on intentions, it survives on action." Sometimes those conversations planted seeds. Sometimes they simply offered comfort. Either way, their pain had become purposeful. One evening, while cleaning out the garage, Mark found the box from the divorce, the legal documents, the old bank statements, the finality that once felt so heavy. He brought it inside, unsure whether to keep it or let it go. Emily sat beside him as they went through it, page by page, neither rushing nor avoiding the memories. When they reached the decree, Emily traced the date with her finger and said softly, "I don't hate this anymore." Mark looked at her, surprised. She explained that without that ending, they might never have confronted the truth about themselves. The divorce, painful as it was, had been the interruption that forced transformation. Together, they shredded the papers, not in anger, but in release. Time softened their edges, but sharpened their awareness. They grew older together with an honesty that felt rare and earned. Gray hair appeared, laughter lines deepened. The passion between them didn't fade, it matured, rooted in trust rather than novelty. On anniversaries, they revisited the story of how they found their way back, not to dwell on pain, but to remember the cost of complacency. They promised each other, year after year, never to assume love would survive on memory alone. Late one night, during a power outage caused by a summer storm, they sat on the floor by candlelight, talking about everything and nothing. Emily asked Mark if he ever regretted coming back, if life might have been easier had they stayed apart. Mark didn't answer immediately. He thought about the loneliness of his apartment, the hollow success, the nights he'd wondered what might have been. Then he looked at Emily, really looked at her, and said no, not because the road was easy, but because it was real. Emily smiled, tears catching the candlelight, and told him she felt the same. They both understood then that ease had never been the measure of a meaningful life. In the final seasons of their story, love didn't announce itself loudly. It lived in habits, in checking in choosing patience, in the quiet confidence that they could face whatever came next together. Their journey had been marked by endings, yes, but also by brave beginnings born from pain. Divorce had once defined them. Now it was simply a chapter, one that no longer held power over the rest of the pages. And if anyone asked what ultimately saved their marriage, Emily would say it was the moment they stopped running from discomfort and leaned into honesty. Mark would say it was the day they realized love isn't proven when it's easy, but when it's tested and chosen anyway. Their lives stood as living proof that even after vows are broken and papers are signed, love can survive, return, and grow deeper than it ever was before, if two people are willing to do the hard, sacred work of rebuilding from the ground up. In the last stretch of their lives together, love no longer felt like something they were trying to protect. It felt like something that carried them. The urgency of proving anything to the world had faded. What remained was presence. Mornings began slowly now. Mark brewed the coffee while Emily watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, the same window she once stood beside, wondering if she had destroyed her life by walking away. Now she understood that leaving had not been the failure, staying silent had been. They talked more softly these days, not because they had less to say, but because they had learned how deeply words could matter. As retirement approached, Mark wrestled briefly with the fear of losing purpose again, but this time he didn't hide it, he spoke it aloud, and Emily listened without trying to fix him. Together they imagined a future measured not by productivity, but by meaning. They volunteered, they traveled modestly, they spent time mentoring younger couples, not as experts, but as witnesses. People who had seen how easily love could fracture and how painstakingly it could be rebuilt. When couples sat across from them, eyes heavy with resentment or grief, Emily would often say, "If love is still hurting, it's still alive." And Mark would add, "But it has to be fed differently than it was before." There were quiet losses, too. Friends passed away, parents grew frail, time asked for things they couldn't get back. On those nights, Emily sometimes cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the weight of impermanence. Mark held her then, steady and unafraid of her sorrow. He no longer tried to be strong by being distant. He had learned that strength lived in staying, in allowing grief to exist without rushing it out the door, in letting love bear witness to pain instead of trying to outrun it. One evening, as they sorted through old photographs for their children, Emily paused on an image taken years after their remarriage. They were standing in the backyard, arms around each other, nothing extraordinary about the moment, but she stared at it for a long time. "This," she said quietly, "this is what I almost lost." Mark nodded, understanding without explanation. They both knew that the greatest tragedy wouldn't have been the divorce, it would have been never finding their way back to the truth of who they were together. As their story reached its gentler chapters, Emily fell ill again, not with cancer this time, but with the slow, inevitable wear of age. Hospital rooms returned, but fear did not take center stage. Mark sat beside her bed, reading aloud, holding her hand, reminding her of all the ways love had shown up for them when they needed it most. One afternoon, she looked at him with a calm that only comes from acceptance, and said, "Promise me you'll remember that we did this. We chose each other twice." Mark swallowed hard and promised, knowing that loving her meant carrying their story forward no matter what came next. When Emily passed, it was quiet, peaceful. Mark stayed with her long after, pressing his forehead to hers, thanking her, not just for loving him, but for forgiving him, for returning, for teaching him how to be fully present.
Grief came in waves, but it was not hollow. It was full of meaning, full of memory, full of a love that had not ended, only changed form. Years later, when Mark told their story, he never skipped the divorce. He never softened the pain. He spoke of it honestly because it was the place where everything had been lost and where everything had begun again. He told people that love doesn't always survive because it's strong. Sometimes it survives because people are brave enough to face themselves, to return humbled, to rebuild without guarantees. And in the end, that was the legacy they left behind. Not perfection, not uninterrupted happiness, but proof. Proof that divorce doesn't always kill love, that endings can become doorways, that two imperfect people, willing to grow, forgive, and stay, can turn even the most painful separation into a deeper, truer union. Their journey back to each other never truly ended. It lived on in every person who heard their story and chose hope instead of resignation. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between regret and redemption, love remained, unbroken, transformed, and eternal.